In this video lecture, I'm going to be mainly focusing on Epicurean ethics within the writings that survive or that are told by those after Epicurus himself. Epicurus lived 341 to roughly 270 BCE, so about just after Aristotle's death, he really starts to come into prominence, into adulthood. One of the other famous Epicureans that really kind of continues on the legacy of Epicureanism is the Roman Lucretius, who lived roughly 99 BCE to 55 BCE. So what I'm going to do in this lecture video is, again, mainly focus on Epicurus, on his ethical arguments. I'm going to begin with actually his critique of determinism, and because that's kind of what really is behind Stoic ethics, for example. Then I'm going to focus on, of course, the Epicurean nature of the good, and then later on look at some of its implications for social theory and understanding death and whether we should be afraid of it or not. So, if we are not free to act as we choose, so let's say all is fated, just as the Stoics argue. Everything is fated, right? The Stoics say we shouldn't be surprised by how nature behaves, what unfolds, because we know the kind of causal determinism that underlies the Stoic physics. So it only brings me suffering, it only brings me pain if I get upset about things that are fated, because they can't be changed any other way. My grieving about them, my becoming angry about whatever it is that happens in the world, if it was out of my control, there's no point in me being upset about at all, because I have to recognize the fatal nature of the world. If we are not free to act as we choose, if all is fated, as the Stoics argue, then Epicurus asks, how could anyone be morally responsible for their actions? Now, of course, the Stoics are going to say, well, look, of course, we say people are causally responsible for their actions, but then we could also say, well, they were determined to act because of previous events that necessitated the outcome of how they act. But regardless, the notions or the concepts of praise and blame are tied to whatever actions end up happening and not necessarily moral agency. It's tied to good or bad actions that are morally praised or blamed. But Epicurus thinks that doesn't really make sense, because praise or blame hinges on agency. He thinks that the entire conception of determinism is actually logically contradictory. He says, the man who says that all events are necessitated has no ground for criticizing the man who says that not all events are necessitated. For according to him, this is itself a necessitated event. So the one who says, according to Epicurus, that everything is fated should have no qualms about those who disagree with their own view, because it was fated that they would disagree with their own view. It's a kind of a similar argument made against epistemic or moral relativism, that the condition itself is subject then to equal or greater disagreement, opposing the idea that morality or truth is relative. So it doesn't seem, according to Epicurus, that you can be logically consistent in holding the idea that all is fated, and that we're going to praise or blame individuals for the actions that they produce, because again, well, it was fated. So it's the same way of, why would you disagree with me? And of course maybe the Stoics might say, well, of course I disagree with you because it was fated that I disagree with you. But then what's the point? Why do anything if it's all fated? There are ultimately three reasons that Epicurus gives as to why it is true that we have free will, that not everything is fated. The first is that although there are physical influences, right? Even the Epicurean is not going to deny that there is some amount of determination, causal, physical determination in the world. But even granting that, if we could not control them, then our moral and critical attitudes to each other would make no sense. Why would I blame you? Why would I get outraged at you and want you to be punished for committing a crime, for example, if it was just fated that you were going to do so, right? You couldn't do anything about it. Maybe we say, well, it's unfortunate what happened to the victim, so we try to compensate the victim, but what's the point in punishing the perpetrator if there was nothing they could do? It was fated that they were going to act that way. So any kind of like moral retributivism, for example, could not be permitted. Secondly, we all share a preconception of our own agency as that which is responsible for our behavior. So Epicurus thinks that all of us actually, when we act, we do conceive of ourselves necessarily as being the agents behind the actions that we enact in the world. If that's the case, then it would seem like it is fated that we do have this preconception of our own agency. And so it's almost kind of turning determinism against itself. And the third reason, that it is pragmatic to act as if we do have free will, since the Stoics don't argue for laziness or inaction anyways. They argue we should try and change ourselves, or at least change how we conceive of things, how we reflect upon things. So then the Epicurean is going to say, well, then we should actually act as if we can affect some outcome in the world, since even the Stoics say, well, we shouldn't just let things happen as they happen. We should try to deal with them better, or produce better outcomes if we're able to produce better outcomes. So it makes sense that we act as if we have free will, and we base our moral theory upon the notion that we have free will. This brings us to the idea of the good for Epicureanism. So hedonism is the view that the good is ultimately the pursuit of pleasure. That moral action, how we ought to live our lives, is to pursue as much pleasure as possible. But it's important to understand that while Epicureanism is a kind of hedonism, because they do argue the ultimate good is pleasure, they're not what's typically thought of when, for example, the term Epicurean is used, right? It can often be like, someone might say, I'm an Epicurean, and they mean that as, well, I have a taste for fine wines, fine food, the finer things in life. But that's actually a misunderstanding of Epicureanism and of the Epicurean understanding of the nature of pleasure as the ultimate good. And we can begin to understand what it means to say that the ultimate good is pleasure, and why, by understanding that it is not pleasure that is pursued, the Epicureans, that Epicurus argues, it's not pleasure that's the ultimate good in itself as a kind of object to possess. Rather, pleasure ultimately, pleasure in its final greatest achievement, is the complete removal of pain. So the greatest pleasure is the absence of pain, not something in itself that is pleasure. Epicurus says, pleasure is the beginning and end of the blessed life, for we recognize pleasure as the good which is primary and congenital. From it, we begin every choice and avoidance, and we come back to it, using the feeling as the yardstick for judging every good thing. So Epicurus says, look, let's look at how animals behave, right? Whether it be a cat, a mouse, a bird, whatever. They all try to avoid pain. We can see this in their actions, what they pursue. They pursue shelter and food and water to avoid the sufferings that come along with, being out in the elements, being dehydrated, starving. Human beings do the exact same thing. They're no different from animals in this sense. Human beings naturally pursue pleasure as opposed to pain. We seek to avoid pain. It's natural for us to do so. So we can see this kind of deference to nature, to modeling or mirroring an ethics on nature. The same for Aristotle, the same for the Stoics. 2 points about this. One, so it's natural for all sentient beings to pursue pleasure and avoid pain. And 2, there's nothing in between pleasure and pain. So that's not to say there aren't degrees of pleasure or degrees of pain. That we can say something is, more pleasurable, as in like, well, eating this nice hamburger is more pleasurable than, I don't know, like clipping my nails or something like that. We can say that having the flu is more painful than getting a paper cut, right? So we can say there are degrees, but there's not something that is completely different, that is not pleasure and it's not pain and it's kind of a neutral thing to be achieved. There is nothing beyond pleasure and pain, even though there can be degrees of pleasure and pain. So I said that it's wrong to conceive of the kind of hedonism that Epicurean argues we ought to pursue as being a kind of maximal pursuit of pleasure. So what the Epicureans argue is not that we ought to pursue, we ought to do as many drugs as possible, we ought to eat as much nice foods as possible, we ought to have as many material goods, as much money as possible. That's not what they argue. When they say that pleasure is the absence of the complete removal of pain is the ultimate good, they mean that we should then, in order to achieve that, actually pursue what they call simple pleasures in order to achieve the complete removal of pain. Now, they say this is because every pleasure is something good. No doubt that having wine and getting a little buzzed is better than being sick. Or, finding joy in buying a new watch is better than, tripping and breaking my leg or something like that. Of course. But it would be wrong to think that we pursue the good by pursuing things like drunkenness, by pursuing things like material goods. So I want to read this passage here from Epicurus in order to explain this on page 114. So he says, every pleasure then, because of its natural affinity, is something good, yet not every pleasure is choice-worthy. Correspondingly, every pain is something bad, but not every pain is by nature to be avoided. However, we have to make our judgment on all these points by a calculation and survey of advantages and disadvantages. For at certain times we treat the good as bad, and conversely the bad as good. We also regard self-sufficiency as a great good, not with the aim of always living off little, but to enable us to live off little if we do not have much. So the idea is not, well, it's a good to live off little. It's only to live off little because ultimately, right, that is the best way to, and that is the sure way to achieve the good of a life without pain. So, but to enable us to live off little if we do not have much, in the genuine conviction that they derive the greatest pleasure from luxury who need it least, and that everything natural is easy to procure, but what is empty is hard to procure. So notice, right, if you have lessened your desires for fine things, it's a lot easier to become satisfied, to become happy, as opposed to if you become accustomed to the finer things in life, so to speak, it's going to become more and more difficult to continually achieve that happiness. Plain flavors produce pleasure equal to an expensive diet whenever all the pain of need has been removed. And bread and water generate the highest pleasure whenever they are taken by one who needs them. So it can be the case, if we practice and work on our desires, that bread and water can pleasure us the most. Therefore, the habit of simple and inexpensive diet maximizes health and makes a man energetic in facing the necessary business of daily life. It also strengthens our character when we encounter luxuries from time to time and emboldens us in the face of fortune. So when we say that pleasure is the end, we do not mean the pleasures of the dissipated and those that consist in having a good time, as some out of ignorance and disagreement or refusal to understand suppose we do, but freedom from pain in the body and from disturbance in the soul. So, the rock and roll life, pursuing wealth, sex, drugs, and the, finer things in life, that is ultimately going now in the short, perhaps even medium term, that is going to result in happiness. But ultimately, it's going to result in pain because, as he says, those kinds of pleasures dissipate. You constantly have to do more and more and more. And as we know, right, you become accustomed, you tolerate that kind of level of, whether it be with the drug, your alcohol tolerance goes up, whatever it may be, right? So you're always kind of chasing something that can never make you whole. Because it's not some pleasure that is going to make you happy, ultimately. It's the absence of pain, or it's to understand the greatest pleasure as the absence of pain. He says, for what produces the pleasant life is not continuous drinking and parties, or pederasty, or womanizing, or the enjoyment of fish and the other dishes of an expensive table, but sober reasoning, which tracks down the causes of every choice and avoidance, and which banishes the opinions that beset souls with the greatest confusion. Of all this, the beginning and the greatest good is prudence. Therefore, prudence is even more precious than philosophy, and it is the natural source of all the remaining virtues. It teaches the impossibility of living pleasurably without living prudently, honorably and justly, and the impossibility of living prudently, honorably and justly without living pleasurably. For the virtues are naturally linked with living pleasurably, and living pleasurably is inseparable from them. So Epicurus distinguishes between three types of desires. The first is natural and necessary desires. So these are the kind of desires that ultimately the Epicurean is going to pursue, that they bring relief from pain, such as, for example, drinking water while thirsty or taking shelter from a storm. So, or the bread, for example, right? Enjoying bread to satiate hunger. Those kinds of desires from minimal pleasures. Those things that come from, having to satiate our natural desires, such as, hunger, thirst, shelter, right? Those are necessary desires and they're naturally occurring. Natural but non-necessary desires are those that also satiate, for example, hunger, thirst, and so on, but they're not necessary because they're merely, some kind of variation on pleasure, but they don't remove pain, at least ultimately. So, for example, expensive foods, alcohol, and so on, right? And actually, interestingly, even meat, Epicurus says, falls under the category of non-necessary, though natural, desires. So ultimately, the best Epicurean, the most virtuous Epicurean, is going to be a vegetarian or perhaps even a vegan. Then third, unnatural and non-necessary desires. So these are not desires that satiate any of thirst, hunger, or shelter, the need for shelter. And they're also some kind of a convention or a social construction. They don't bring relief from physical pain, but rather they offer artificial pleasure, such as Versace clothes and other material goods, or power or honor, things like that that are kind of socially desired, that are labeled as a kind of labeled as being valuable because society says so. Interestingly, there are no unnatural but necessary desires. It would be impossible that there would be some kind of a desire that we ought to pursue, that we ought to satiate, that is socially constructed. So that is the general theory of the good by Epicureanism, of pleasure as the absence of pain. What does that mean for society? Well, first, looking at the idea of justice for Epicureanism. when you read liberal philosophers like John Locke, for example, he argues that when we enter into a government, we do so by making a compromise where we give up some of our rights so that the rest can ultimately be protected by the state. That's why we enter into a political society, a political community. But what's interesting is that Epicurus says, well, we don't make a compromise at all. In fact, the creation of what would be ultimately a just society ruled by a just government is a natural guarantee that that's what we ultimately pursue naturally. And he says this because he takes justice to be a function of utility. So more or less, that which is just is that which is socially useful. There are two things that guarantee or that make a practice or a system or a government just. So first, and we should think of how the Epicureans understand justice, which is in terms of a codified legal system. So they're not thinking of maybe like social justice as something beyond just the formal scope of justice concerning laws. And they're not thinking of justice in terms of maybe the individual in the way that we might think about it in like Plato's Republic, but specifically as a codified legal system. And that legal system will be just if and only if, so it has to satisfy both of these requirements. First, it enables the ability to make contracts. So contracts serve as the basis of society. And this is really reminiscent of, Hume. Hume is going to be influenced by this notion in his conception of justice, because justice is not, for Hume, some natural phenomenon. It's rather useful, although the Epicureans are going to say it's both useful and natural. And then two, a codified legal system will be just if it also actually achieves the intended result of the utility of social relationships. So it can't just be the case that it makes contracts, but those contracts also have to be useful. They have to further the interests of the social contract originally, or those individual contracts that are made between private parties. So I want to look at two quotes here from Epicurus. First, he says, "Nothing is just or unjust in relation to those creatures which were unable to make contracts over not harming one another and not being harmed. So too with all peoples which were unable or unwilling to make contracts over not harming and not being harmed." So what's interesting here is he's saying there is no conception of justice outside of a contract. If a contract has not been made, there is no conception of justice. Is that intuitive to us now? I'm not sure. Secondly, Epicurus says, what is legally deemed to be just has its existence in the domain of justice whenever it is attested to be useful in the requirements of social relationships, whether or not it turns out to be the same for all. But so we could think of as well, basically it's meaning, well, whatever is for the greater good in this sense. Even if some individuals, might suffer a little bit more, as long as the overall happiness is increased, it's just. But he says, if someone makes a law and it does not happen to accord with the utility of social relationships, then that law no longer has the nature of justice. So just because something is a law doesn't mean it's a just law. How about friendship? Well, Epicurus argues that friendship is useful as a system of mutual support. So a true friendship is going to be one that increases pleasure. It is useful. It is in its nature to be pleasurable, to be of utility. He says all friendship is an intrinsic virtue, but it originates from benefiting. So there's an intrinsic virtue to friendship in that there is this system of mutual support where you do genuinely care about the other. But you don't just have a relationship because of that, or it can never be the case that you can have a friendship where there is this mutual support, where you truly care for the other individual and it's not useful or it doesn't bring pleasure. He says neither those who are hesitant should be approved, but it is also necessary to take risks for the sake of friendship. It is not our friends' help that we need so much as the confidence of their help. So friendship necessarily, if it is a genuine friendship, because it is a system of mutual support, does bring about pleasure, is useful. And he also says, they say that friendship is no more separable from pleasure than are the virtues we discussed previously. Although I think this is actually a quote from Cicero on Epicurus. A lonely life without friends is packed with risks and anxieties. So we ought then to pursue friends because they give us the kind of support that's needed for our lives that might be lacking, if we don't have some kind of a welfare state that can help. Like, for example, childcare, you rely on friends maybe for all kinds of things. So if you live an isolated life, if you have no friends, you have no one that can be there in times where you need help. And so you're going to live a life of anxiety. You're going to lead a life full of risks. So he says reason itself advises the formation of friendships. Their acquisition strengthens the mind and gives it the absolutely secure expectation of generating pleasures. This is really interesting because Aristotle actually argues that a virtuous friendship is based on mutual affection alone. He distinguishes three kinds of friendship. That there's a friendship of utility, a friendship of pleasure, both of which are not virtuous friendships, and then the third one is a virtuous friendship, is mutual support solely. But Epicurus is saying, no, that which is useful and that which is pleasurable is one and the same, and the true friendship based on mutual support is necessarily pleasurable and useful, and that is also why we pursue a friendship based on mutual support. The last argument I want to look at as an implication from the Epicurean nature of the good is why they argue it is irrational to fear death. Now, the argument can really be broken down into two premises and one conclusion, although there's a lot of other sub-premises and kind of suppositions that can be explained in their argument. And this is a really famous argument as well, and I think it's one that's probably intuitive, I would say, at least to a certain extent. So the first premise that Epicurus gives is only the living experience pleasure and or pain. So only sentient beings are subject to pleasure or pain. If that's the case, then, it would be irrational to fear that which causes no pain. It would be irrational to fear something if it can never bring you pain. Only, of course, if you were ignorant about the fact that something doesn't bring you pain, would it be maybe rational to fear it, unless you base, your fear on knowledge. The second premise, when we are dead, pain cannot be present. So only the living experience pleasure and or pain, and when we're dead, no pain can be present because only the living experience pleasure and or pain. Well, death is annihilation. There are no sentient beings, right? There is no one that can be the subject of pleasure or pain in death. What's interesting is that before we were born, we did not suffer. Before we were born, we were not living, and therefore we did not experience pleasure or pain. Well, if we die, then post-life would also be a state of no pleasure or pain because there is no living experience possible. So what Epicurus is doing here, he's drawing an analogy, or he's making a symmetry between pre-life and post-life and saying, look, we didn't fear the time before we were born, and we don't fear it now. And we don't fear it because there was nothing to fear. The possibility of pain did not exist. Well, if we didn't fear that state of non-existence before existence, and that state of non-existence is symmetrical to the state of non-existence after life, then we also have no reason to fear death because there can be no pain in death. Now, there can be pain, of course, in the process of dying, but death itself cannot be painful. So it's irrational to fear death. We only suffer in anticipation of death. And once we come to see the irrationality of why we shouldn't fear death, then we should stop suffering because of the anticipation of death, because there's nothing to fear. In fact, Epicurus says, "The wise man neither deprecates living nor fears living, for he neither finds living irksome nor thinks not living an evil. But just as he chooses the pleasantest food, or simply the greater quantity, so too he enjoys the pleasantest time, nor the longest. He who advises the young man to live well, but the old man to die well, is naive, not only because life is something to be welcomed, but also because to practice living well and to practice dying well are one and the same." Thomas Nagel, in a 1970 article titled "Death," actually criticized this argument given by Epicurus. Nagel thought that the symmetry drawn between pre-life and post-life by Epicurus is not correct. Nagel thinks there's an asymmetry. His argument works roughly like this. The first premise: it's true that both the time before and after death we do not exist. However, the time after death is a time in which one is deprived. We're deprived of potential experiences that we've come to enjoy or that we think about the possibility of having. So the loss of potential life makes posthumous non-existence more unfortunate than prenatal non-existence, because before I'm born, I'm not deprived of any experience because there is no me to experience anything at all. So when I die, though, later on after having lived, I am deprived of potential goods and experiences. And because I'm deprived of those potential goods and experiences I could have had if I lived another day, another year, another decade, or whatever, then it is rational to fear death for fearing the lack of experiencing those goods and so on. What's interesting then is Nagel thinks this is intuitive, because this is why we grieve at those who die younger than those who die older. Because if you die older, you've had more time to experience different things. But someone who's died younger hasn't had as much time. They haven't had the potential, or that potential was cut short. And so he thinks his argument as to why the state pre-existence and post-existence is asymmetrical is actually intuitive, because it corresponds to why we grieve perhaps greater for a younger person that has died as opposed to someone in old age. So, do you think Nagel's critique of the Epicurean argument as to why we shouldn't fear death is intuitive? Is the state of pre-life and post-life asymmetrical? Or is Epicurus correct that, well, in both states there is no pain, and so it's irrational, ultimately, to fear death?